Whenever we talk about the need to embrace sustainable beauty, one common criticism you might hear is, oh, but consumers aren't asking for it. Or they are asking for it, but then they don't put their money where their mouth is. But an interesting point to consider is that consumers can't demand what they don't know exists. And when brands hide behind that argument, they're not necessarily listening to the market, but actually they might just be avoiding responsibility. So last week on the podcast, I spoke with Alexander van Oort from Forestwise, a company working in Borneo to give standing rainforests economic value. Forestwise partners with smallholder farmers who harvest wild forest ingredients like ilipe nuts, from which they create ilipe butter, which is a natural alternative to cocoa butter used by brands such as Lush. And if you haven't heard that interview yet, make sure you go and listen to it now because it was really interesting and the work they're doing is fascinating. And in our interview, Alexander pointed out that big brands often say there's no consumer demand for sustainable materials. But then he said, well, how can there be if we as shoppers never even see the choice? So the model that Forestwise uses shows what's possible when sustainability isn't left to chance or consumer pressure, but is instead built into the business model itself. And it got me thinking about how often beauty brands shift accountability onto the end buyer instead of leading the change themselves. So that's what we're going to explore on the podcast today when I put forward my slightly controversial call to ask the beauty industry to stop blaming the people who buy their products. Hi, it's Lorraine Dallmeier, Chartered Environmentalist, Biologist and CEO of the award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school Formula Botanica. I host the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, and these are my Green Beauty opinions, where I share my takeaways from last week's episode and challenge you to think differently about the beauty industry. If you love hearing my thoughts on green beauty, make sure you subscribe now so you never miss an episode. So this idea that the consumer decides has become a popular myth, including, of course, the beauty industry too. And this myth is convenient because it keeps the current system intact. So if a shopper doesn't ask for a forest-friendly ingredient, the logic grows, then there's no need to offer it. But most people buying a face cream have literally no idea what's in it, let alone how that ingredient was sourced and the fact that that ingredient might even affect deforestation in Borneo. So shoppers are busy, they're underinformed, they're often misled by greenwashing. And expecting the people who buy the beauty products to drive industry change is unrealistic and unfair, in my opinion. So in a previous life, I worked in the oil and gas industry as an environmental scientist. And yes, believe me, I know those two things are very incompatible, which is also why I left, because I realized I couldn't change them from the inside either. And that's a whole other story. But when I used to talk to people about the need to shift to renewables and away from the extraction of fossil fuels, the answer I was given was always the same. We'll do it when they regulate for it. And while I appreciate that's a bigger topic of discussion for a very different podcast, it does boil down to the same. They were effectively also saying, we're not going to change unless someone tells us that they want us to. But the power to change supply chains sits higher up the ladder than with the shopper. Brands and manufacturers choose what ingredients to formulate with, and they choose which suppliers to support, and they choose how transparent they want to be. And when they claim that they're just giving people what they want, what they're really saying is that they'd rather wait for demand than create it themselves. But leadership means setting a direction. It's not following the crowd. So McKinsey recently ran a survey on packaging sustainability in the US, which concluded that most shoppers believe that brand owners and packaging producers, so not the shoppers themselves, should carry the primary burden for sustainable packaging. Makes sense, right? You know, it's also unfair, really, to expect everyday buyers who are already juggling tight budgets and limited time and very confusing product labels to be the drivers of systemic transformation. So the gap between what consumers want and what they can realistically do shows up everywhere in beauty. And I think there's a really good example here with refill systems. Now, I've talked a lot about refillable beauty here on the podcast. Just go and search for refillable green beauty conversations. You'll find plenty of episodes. And over the past few years, big brands from Chanel to Charlotte Tilbury have launched refillable ranges, hailing them as the future of luxury sustainable beauty. But when uptake turned out to be slow, the conversation quietly shifted to consumer behavior. They said people love the idea, but they're just not ready to change their habits yet. And then Vogue Business did an analysis of refillable beauty a couple of years ago, and they summed it up perfectly by saying, refills require a consumer to commit to a product for months or years, And then convenience, habit, and hygiene concerns all play against adoption. This was all in the article. But that's not a failure of the shopper. It's a design problem. And I think it's unreasonable to frame that as consumer reluctance when the beauty industry itself isn't built to make refilling easy. And ultimately, I think this is the main crux of the argument here. Brands shape what people see and what they value and what they believe is normal. And if the beauty industry can persuade people that they need 10 steps in their skincare routine, then it can also persuade them that less waste and more transparency are worth paying for. So what I loved about Forest Wise's story is that it proves that you can build demand by doing the right thing first. And their partnerships didn't start because consumers asked for a Lipe butter. They started because the company saw a way to make conservation economically viable. And then forward-thinking brands like Lush recognized the opportunity to align their values with that meaningful impact. And that's what real market transformation looks like. Because the reality is, people do care. They just can't always act on those values when the infrastructure around them makes it hard. And that's why the responsibility for progress has to sit with the companies that design and manufacture and market the beauty products, not the people trying to choose between them. So I think the next phase of sustainable beauty will come from the brands that redesign the system so that choice, the sustainable choice, is the easiest one. So my slightly controversial challenge to the beauty industry this week is simple. Stop hiding behind the myth of consumer demand. Stop saying they're not asking for it, when in truth, you're not offering it in the way that works. Lead the change. Build the systems that reward better decisions. Because the industry that helped create today's beauty habits has the power and the obligation to create new ones. And my challenge to you as a listener is this. As consumers, we often underestimate our own role in this story. We're told that individual choices are too small to matter, or maybe we just feel that we can't make an impact as one person. And of course, we can't rebuild global supply chains on our own, but we can reward the brands that are trying. And every time we choose a product made with a responsibly sourced ingredient, we send a signal that values transparency and long-term thinking over convenience and cost-cutting. So let's do that. There are some amazing brands out there doing awesome work. Let's lift them up as high as we can. Thank you for listening to my Green Beauty Opinions. Remember to visit formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, please do so now in your favorite podcast app. Leave me a 5-star review if you enjoy these discussions and opinions. And I'll be back soon with my next episode.